Dissection of a Murder is a legal courtroom thriller which is set in Newcastle and Durham. It centres around the murder of a Crown Court judge whose body is found at the flat of a prolific criminal called Jack Millman. When he's arrested on suspicion of murder, he says two things. Firstly, he says, "I'm not guilty and I'm not saying anything else until trial." And secondly, the only person I want to represent me is a barrister called Leila Reynolds, our protagonist. Leila's never done a case like this before, and she's horrified to learn that the prosecutor in the case is her former pupil master, the man who nurtured her and taught her everything that she knows. He's also her husband. It's ultimately a book about control, how we wield it over others and manage it within ourselves. It also explores how far people are prepared to go in their quest for success. I wanted to write the kind of book that I enjoyed reading myself. I wanted the end result to feel clever and intricate with a big twist, so readers would reach the end and then want to immediately start reading it again to try and pick up on all the clues that they missed the first time. But the idea for this book really started with one question: is it possible to manipulate a jury? Because as advocates, we know how evidence works and we know how criminals get caught. And integrity and honesty are at the foundation of everything that we do. So what happens if you have a barrister who would do anything to secure a conviction or an acquittal? That's what this book is about. I think we share the same northern grit and determination to succeed. Leila's refusal to be defined by where she grew up is drawn from me and so many other women in a similar position. In the book, Leila very much feels like an outsider in the elite world of the bar, despite having shown that she deserves to be there. And that's something I experience too, and it can feel isolating and demoralising after years of struggle to get there. I think it's more illustrative of how northern working class women are portrayed generally in professional male-dominated environments, particularly if they have a northern accent, which I do and I'm fiercely proud of. The presumption is that you're thick, and I hated this at first because I'd worked too hard to be stereotyped, but then I realised that it was quite a powerful tool and I weaponised it. I learned that people let their guard down when they underestimate you and they work on the assumption that you're stupid. I think it's just continuing to surprise people. Always looking for twists and turns of the story, catching people off guard, always doing the unexpected and getting a thrill out of watching people's jaws drop and creating characters that continually reveal themselves to be not quite who you initially thought they were, and always having characters as underdogs. I live for all of that. I knew from a very early stage that the protagonist in this novel was going to be an exceptionally controlled character, so that was deliberate. My favourite female characters in fiction are those who have emotional blind spots, which either turn out to be something they know is there and they refuse to deal with, or they haven't quite worked out why it's there, and it's the writer's job to turn their head and force them to confront it. But it's always how they then deal with it that's interesting to me. I think in recent years there have been quite a lot of women in fiction being messy in the way women tend to be presented as spiralling or self-destructive, and this usually looks like partying, taking drugs, drinking. It's very outward extrovert behaviour, and I wanted to examine the opposite, quieter way in which women self-destruct, which can be equally as damaging, but it originates from an obsessive need for control. And also dig beneath that surface and look at why you'd become like that in the first place. Where would that kind of behaviour originate in a woman's life and why? I think so, yeah. There's no way I could have written this book had I not been a criminal barrister. And I think not just because I understand the procedure of how trials work, although that was a crucial part of this book, but because I wanted to take the reader on a journey all the way from arrest through to verdict. I think that, coupled with this kind of book, with its intricacies and fluency of how advocacy and trials work in real life, has enabled me to create that perfect crime. And I think the killer in the book would certainly agree with me on that. One of the themes in the novel is how we make assumptions based on how people look And this is no different in court. When a jury sits for days, weeks, or sometimes months in a criminal trial, it's inevitable they will form opinions based on counsel in the case, which can potentially lead to how a verdict is reached. Julian, the prosecutor in the case, is the typical male barrister. He's aggressive, he's confident, charming, charismatic and flamboyant, and Leila is the complete opposite. She's quietly confident, she holds her cards close to her chest, and she has a vulnerability about her, and ultimately she's seen as inexperienced because she's smaller than him and she's underestimated because of it. And the biggest personalities usually stand out to a jury at the bar, but they don't necessarily make the best barristers, as you'll find out. Fiction's such a great place to explore these grey areas, and many of which we are confronted with in practice. Professional ethics is such a huge part of what we do, and we always have to balance that with our professional obligations. And in fiction, we're able to play around with this more. And I think as we get older, our perspective on the world becomes more complicated and alters our views on these subjects. Because you have 12 people from different backgrounds, different childhoods, they all have different moral values, and they're thrown together to evaluate whether someone has committed a criminal offence. I've been fascinated with the jury since I first watched the film 12 Angry Men as a kid, and that continued all the way through criminal practice because it's the one thing that we as advocates can't see in a trial. We never know what's said or how a verdict is reached. But I used to watch the jury and think to myself, the evidence we're presenting to you is black and white, but the way we can present it to you isn't. And ultimately, jurors need a narrative, a story which makes sense, and sometimes, with the right direction, you can steer them where they need to be. Dissection of a Murder examines what happens if you have a barrister who would do absolutely anything to secure a conviction or an acquittal. Because to the average person on the street, defendants are always guilty until proven innocent. No smoke without fire. You hear that all the time. And I used to walk into client conferences before hearings, and I didn't see a criminal. I saw a dad, a son, a brother, or a child. And they'd often have pages full of criminal convictions, but nobody wakes up one day and decides to become a drug dealer or an addict or a thief. There was never any judgment in my conferences, because what I always wanted to know was, at what point did you learn that violence was an acceptable way to solve conflict? Or what was going on at home to make you feel like the criminal gang you hung around with was more like a family than your own? Because this is what a lot of people don't understand, that criminality doesn't start out of boredom. It begins with abuse or addiction and a whole host of other complicated issues in a young person's life. There's a story behind every single person who ends up in the dock. And in conferences, I always wanted to know what brought you here. That's the inspiration of where the character of Jack came from. Not one particular case, but I wanted to show the pressure on a defence barrister's shoulders when we're representing someone in court. Yeah, it's a job, but we're very aware that we have the person's liberty in our hands. For Leila, this isn't just a case of proving herself to her peers. She genuinely believes Jack is innocent, and she will do anything to secure a not guilty verdict. On a personal level, it's been very easy because I never changed when I became a barrister. From a practical point of view, I planned this book like it was a case. I think that's why it's so intricate. And when I was piecing the murder together, I was doing it as if it was a real case I was working on. So I planned the trial, which makes up the entire second half of the novel, like it was a real case. I'm a huge planner, and the planning part of writing takes significantly longer than writing the actual book for me. I don't start a first draft until I've fleshed out every single character and planned out every single chapter and scene in the novel. Especially when you're writing intricate thrillers like this one, there's no way I could write that on the fly. Yes, absolutely. I loved writing a particular cross-examination scene in the trial, and the reason I loved it is because the barrister's advocacy style is so different to mine. I'm more of a smiling assassin, lead you down the garden path, be really nice to you, and then drop you in it before you've had time to realise what's going on kind of advocate. Whereas this other barrister is so aggressive, so combative, and just so unbelievably arrogant. And it was so much fun to play that part in fiction. I could never carry that off in real life. It's very male behaviour. I very much lean towards complicated female-centric protagonists against twisty backdrops, and I think writers like Alice Feeney and Sarah Vaughan do these so well. I'm also an enormous fan of Adele Parks, who is also from Teesside, and she's always inspired me, and I remember writing to her years ago for writing advice, and she sent the most encouraging reply back, which was so kind of her. I think the whole writing community is truly special.